Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this how-to, we're going to learn how to design complex components in Figma. The components we're going to build have variations in theme, layout, and subcomponents, so we'll be taking advantage of Figma's layout grids and instant swapping to make it possible. We're going to design multiple variations of a card UI, but the approaches we'll cover can be used to build components at any scale and complexity. Before we get started, let's take stock of the elements we'll be building with. Here we've broken things out with an atomic design mentality. So starting off, we have design particles for our spacing, as well as color swatches that we'll use throughout the design. Next up, we have some design atoms for our typography. We have an image watermark, and also a chevron icon that we'll use. Lastly, we have design molecules for our buttons and our text links. If you'd like to see how to build these button components that can be swapped for various color, theme, and states, and also adapt based on the text width, check out the Build UX video on how to design flexible button components in Figma. The link will be in the description. For these text links, they were built using the exact same approach as the buttons, so they also have multiple states and themes that we can swap between. The strategy used to build both the buttons and the links is a good starting point for how we can approach designing more complex components. We're just going to take things to the next level to allow for more intricate layouts and variations. So to get things started, we have an organisms section of our design files, and we have this frame that's prepared for our cards that we're going to build. Let's start building out an initial card component, which will act as a master component, and we'll use this as basically the starting point for all variations of our cards. So to kick things off, let's select our card's artboard here, and I'm going to hit R to bring out the rectangle tool, and let's just drag out a rectangle of any size to act as the backing plate for our card. I'm going to set the width to be 360, and in terms of the height, we still have to account for all the vertical spacing of different elements in the card, so let's just set it around 500 as a start, and then from there we can always adjust further. Okay, and with that background that we created, let's change the fill to be this charcoal 23 value as part of the color swatches that we established. Next up, let's give it a slight border radius, so let's give it 4 pixels all around on all 4 sides. And then let's also add an effect layer. Let's do a drop shadow. For the blur, I think I'm going to want the blur to be pretty high. So let's say 32 on the blur. I don't want any X displacement, so we'll keep that at 0. Y looks good at 4 pixels. And the opacity, since it is on a dark background, let's bump this up to around 50%. Okay, so that's looking good here. Let's adjust things to be spaced evenly within our frame, just to keep our design files organized. All right, now we have the backing plate of our initial card component established. Let's go ahead and rename this rectangle to be card plate. And from here, we can start working on the subcomponents of this initial card design. So I think we're going to start by designing for the maximum use case of this card. And it'll include an image up top, a title, some paragraph copy, and a call to action button at the bottom. And what we'll do is basically we'll establish this as the master or primitive component, and then from here we'll create variations of the card that may have fewer elements or different combinations of subcomponents within it. But basically we want to account for what's the maximum use case as a start, and that way we can figure out all the different spacing rules that we'll need. So for the card image at the top, let's use our rectangle tool, and let's just drag out a rectangle that matches the width of our card. So let's make sure this is 360 in width and is also aligned to the center. Now in terms of establishing the height, we could just eyeball it, but as I mentioned at the beginning, with our design particles, we actually have these spacing components that we can use to help make decisions for us. And these spacers basically keep everything on a nice grid with a nice scale to them so that everything feels rhythmic. So I'm going to drag in this 192 by 192 spacer, and we can use that really quickly as a reference to snap in the height of our card image. While we're at it, let's rename this rectangle to be card image. And I think this spacer is going to be one of many as we start scaffolding out the layout rules within this card. So let's just group this and rename it to be the spacing layer. Cool, and we can just toggle that off when we're not using it. With this card image, I want to match the border radius on the top left and top right. So we're going to hit this independent corners feature in Figma. The top left is going to be 4 pixels, the top right is also going to be 4 pixels. Now we see that it matches the rounded corners that we have on the card plate. Just to finish this off, let's go back to our Components tab here. And under the Images components, we can drag in this Watermark component that we created and just get it centered up in our card image. So let's drag this down in our layers. We can maybe rename this to be the card image watermark. And then while we're at it, let's call this the plate. We can group these 2 layers now and just call this the card image. And that takes care of the first subcomponent that we'll need in this card. Next up, I want to figure out the left and right spacing for the text content as well as the button that we'll have in place. So we'll go back to our Components tab. Let's open up our spacing and let's drag in a 32 pixel square spacer that we'll use. We can turn back on our spacing group and drag this down. Basically, I know I want 32 pixel margin on the left and right of our card. So we'll drag out instances of this spacer to reflect that. And I think I also want the same spacing rules to hold true for the space between the card image and the content, as well as the content and the bottom edge of the card. Next up, let's hit T for the text tool, and let's drag out some paragraph text here. And we can use these spacers to help basically size that layer up. So let me get that restored here instead of clicking off. And first up, let's make sure our text alignment is going to be left aligned. And within this, we can type out the words, "The discovery process" will be the title of this card. So I'm going to make this fill go to this birch color so we can see what we're doing here. And in terms of the type spec, we actually want to apply the title text style. So with this in place, we now can size our text box as needed to make sure it has the correct vertical and horizontal spacing that we're looking for. And now after this title, we have paragraph spacing on this text style. So we can simply hit enter to go to a new line. And then I'm going to grab some copy that we'll want to paste in here. This will just be some paragraph text that we'll use. And so we can just paste that in place and make sure that this text instead uses the copy default text style. So we'll click that. Now you can see that we have this more paragraph text style in place. From here, one thing that's handy is to basically look at using rulers where the bottom of the line height for this text comes into play. So I want to drag in a ruler that matches the bottom edge here. And what we can do from here is grab this paragraph layer and have it snap to that ruler. I don't think we'll need this ruler for anything else, so we can delete it. It's just a temporary helper to establish the correct dimension of this text box. But this should mimic the actual typographic layout that we'll see when we implement this in an actual website. So it's good to always base the frames that we have around our text based on the actual line height as we see it when the text is selected. All right, so I'm going to drag this text layer down below the image and above the plate. And let's call this the card body. Next up, I think the last element we need for this particular use case in our card is going to be a button component. So we built those buttons ahead of time. And I think we're going to want this default birch button to come to play. So now a really cool thing of using these spacers is our buttons actually have this extra spacing around them, which if we were to toggle between instances for the button component, you'd see that this is actually a placeholder for a focus ring. But in actuality, outlines and focus rings shouldn't affect surrounding layout. So we'll want to revert this to our default instance of the button and align things based on the actual button background to achieve the spacing that we're looking for. So spacers are a handy way to basically predict the actual dimension and how it'll affect the layout while still retaining that vertical rhythm that we're going for. Now I'm going to temporarily grab this spacer that we used for the left and right margin and just drag it down to our button so that way we can get the left and right spacing dialed in as well. And so with that established, I think we can probably get rid of this particular spacer for now. And as I mentioned, this layer is just a temporary working layer to quickly get things arranged as needed. But a huge advantage of keeping these spacing components inside of your components or your designs in general is it's basically great documentation when it comes time for developer handoff. So if you were to hand off this design to a developer, and you see these spacing rules shown as you see it here, it's really handy for the developer to figure out what the actual margins are between elements instead of relying on things like the component frames to guess at how much spacing around they might need to achieve that certain layout. So you can see with the button, for example, because Figma counts the focus ring as part of the actual component size, here we would see that it's 24 pixel margin between the left and bottom edges. But in reality, because we know focus rings don't affect layout when it comes time to build out the CSS for this button, we know we actually want 32 pixel spacing on the left and bottom edge of the card. So with that in place, let's turn our attention next to getting the spacing between the card body and this button. So we'll drag that spacer down, and you can see that basically we want this button to have 32 pixel gap between the card body and the bottom of the card. So we'll bump this up, and now what we can do actually is take the card plate, if we select that bottommost layer, and dial in the height that we'll need to achieve that layout. So let me actually get this bottom spacer in place, and that'll act as an anchor for where the bottom edge of this card should end up. So now if we zoom in just to double check we're dead on, it looks like our final height for this particular combination of elements will be 676. Keep in mind this would obviously fluctuate as typography would change in the card, but just as an initial representation of this use case for a card, this is looking like a pretty good example. So let's drag this button birch that we dropped into our card down to come below the body, and let's rename this to card button. And I think at this point, we're actually ready to make this into a true component. So what I'm going to do is select all of these card layers, and you can either right click and go to create component, or in terms of a keyboard shortcut, you can say Control or Command plus Alt or Option and K. So I'm going to hit Control Alt K to make a component, and let's rename this component to be the card, and this will be our primitive, basically our master component for all that are instances of cards to be based on. All right, so with that as a component, what we can do now is actually use layout grids that we see here in the right sidebar. And we're going to be using these to basically formalize the spacing that we see here in the component, but it'll actually help us when the component changes width or height, or we add variations to the sub elements within the component to make sure that everything adheres to its correct positioning. So first off, let's add an initial layout grid, and we'll focus on getting the left and right spacing established here. So instead of grid, let's click in here and we'll want a column layout. Let's turn the count to be 1. The gutter will actually be 0. And then this left and right margin we can say is 32. Let's also bump up the opacity to 50% just to make it easier to see. And now you can see that this actually matches the left and right spacers that we put in place. But what's really cool is if we give layout rules to each of the elements inside of this card, which we'll do in just a minute, we can actually force them to respect these margins that we're establishing. So with the left and right margins established, let's add another layout grid. And I'm going to drag this below just to stay organized here. This one will actually be for the top and bottom margins. So we'll have a row layout. It'll be 1 row, 0 gutter, 32 pixel margin, and turn our opacity up. And so now you can see that this bottom margin makes sense. Right now, because we have the card being shown, this top margin isn't being used, but we'll have a simpler variation of this card that's basically just text only, and that's when this will come into play in just a second here. Next up, I'd like to create another layout grid that basically shows the spacing, the layout between this body within the card and the button at the bottom. And this will be specific to this particular variation of the card. As we create other variations, what we'll see is we can basically turn on and off specific layout grids as part of that component variation. And that way things adapt as needed to kind of make sense with whatever layout rules or combination of components we'll have. So let's add yet another layout grid. Again, drag this to the bottom. This will be a row once more. We're only gonna have 1 row, 0 gutter. And I don't know where this should end up exactly, but I'm guessing it's around maybe 100 pixels from the bottom. Let's turn the opacity up. And I basically want it to demonstrate the bottom edge of this typography that we see here. So with that, we can see that we're too low. Let's move this up until it hits dead on. It looks like that happens at 124 pixels. So we'll have that in place now as an actual layout dimension. And the last thing that we could do is create another row that would show the top of the title for this particular situation. So we can drag yet another layout grid in place, bring it to the bottom of our layers. It'll be 1 row, 0 gutter. And we know that the bottom of the image is at 192 plus that 32 that we see there. So that'll actually be at 224. And once more, make sure our opacity looks good. Now you can see that everything's in place. So here's a little bit of a trade-off with using layout grids at too granular of a level. Here we can see that although we have our title alignment being shown very clearly in place, it's symmetrical in how it shows up in the component. So we have this ruler that basically just intersects the body copy. And you can see the same thing with the bottom of this card body. We have this layout grid. It also intersects our image up top. So there's a balance with layout grids to basically formalize some of the layout rules that are handy and need to be more dynamic, which we'll see in just a second here, and also providing helpful documentation for developer handoff. But one difficult thing is having too many layout lines or grids or columns can kind of create confusion around what are the actual layout rules, or if there's a symmetrical layout grid on top and bottom, which one is actually supposed to be in use. Now, it might be helpful if Figma supported the ability to name these layout grid layers, because then you might be able to identify which one's for the title, which one's for the button, and kind of quickly see, based on various situations, which one of these lines is supposed to be intended. But for now, we just kind of have to balance documenting our decisions with not being too confusing. So I think for now, maybe we want to turn this bottommost layer off temporarily, just to avoid any confusion as we work on these variations. And to help with the confusion, having these spacer components as part of the actual layers inside of the component is super helpful for clearing things up. Now, typically we'd have this spacing layer turned off, of course, in our designs, but it's something that can always act as a helpful resource as needed. So now with our layout grid in place, what we can do is actually go through these different components and decide on their layout rules or their constraints. So here on the right, you can see our constraints options, and we have our card image selected. We know we want this to scale with the left and right. Let's actually make sure we select only the card plate in this case. So this will scale with the left and right edges of the component, and we want it to be pinned to the top. Our watermark within this, we can just pin to the center of the component and also pin it to the top. Next up, if we go to the card body, we want this to scale left and right and also be constrained to the top of the card. Lastly, going down to our card button, this will actually be pinned to the left and then the bottom for the vertical constraint. Now what's really cool is if we click on our component layer and we adjust the width of this component, everything scales as needed. And we can see how this scaling affects the available typography that we have. So let's restore that back to 360. And a similar thing would be true if we were to alter the height of the component. So you can see that the button is pinned to the bottom. It looks like we have some scaling going on with our spacers, so we can just address that really quickly here. All of these, let's just say, are going to be fixed to the left and the top. We might be able to get more granular with some of these, like these bottom spacers, for example. So these will be in the center and bottom. This one would also be center and top. This will be pinned to the right and the top. Actually, we can do a vertical centering on this one, as well as the left margin here. So left and center, and left and top for that biggest spacer we have up there. So now even these should retain their layout proportions as needed. Cool, so with all that established, we can start working on variations of this card component. And this is really where the power of these complex component layouts comes into effect. So with this initial component established, now we can start thinking through how to create our variations that we're looking for all using this master component to handle all those different situations. So I think the first thing we want to tackle is a slight variation of this current layout, where the only difference will be we want a little more prominent call to action button that extends the full width of the card, taking into account the left and right margins. So we can go into our card primitive component here. Let's grab our card button and duplicate this. And let's rename this layer to be button block. Basically, it's going to be a block level button that extends the full width of the available layout. And so now what we can do with this component selected is go to the width here and adjust things as needed to hit on that right edge as we'd expect. We can also change the layout constraints to be pinned to the left and right, and that way the width of this scales as needed as our card changes width. One thing I forgot to do is let's update the text of these buttons just to be a little more specific to this example use case. So we'll just say learn more as the button text. And let's turn off our button block and make sure we do the same for our default button as well. So this will also say learn more. We might need to adjust the width of this particular instance, so that way we only have the padding that we need. You can see this is another example of layout grids coming into effect. The padding that we're looking for inside of that button is shown with that very faint layout grid that we're seeing here with the vertical lines. So with that taken care of, we have our variation that shows this button block, which is great. I think the next variation that we want to tackle is a little bit more of a simplified card that basically just has the card body and a normal button as well. So with that, basically we wouldn't have a card image. Let's just turn off our spacing layers for now. And to accommodate this variation, I think what we'll want to do is duplicate this body layer and call it body, maybe standalone, to designate it as content that's going to be the only main content in this card. So with this layer selected, now we can shift this up to match that top margin that we established with our layout rules. And let's make sure it hits on that exactly. And from here, what we'd be able to do is to basically adjust the height of the overall card to bring this button up, so that way this layout grid hits exactly on the bottom of this text. However, since we're planning for all variations with this initial instance first, we're going to hold off on that until we drag out dedicated variations of the component. So let's turn that back off and think through what other variations we need to plan for at this stage. So I think actually with this standalone use case where we just have text on its own, instead of a button that's a little too much affordance, so I think we actually want to go into our components tab and let's drag in a text link instead. And this will be the birch link for this dark UI theme. And let's zoom in a bit here and figure out the exact placement that we're looking for. We can also update this text to be a little more relevant. And again, on this component layer, we can adjust the width so that way the text doesn't wrap. And let's drag this down in our layers to be the card text link. And one consideration with this particular variation is that we still want 32 pixel space in between the card body and the text link, but obviously the link is a little bit shorter than our button that we see here. So I'm going to turn our spacing layer back on and let's just temporarily disable some of these layers that we won't be needing. While we're at it, we can drag these to be a little bit more intuitive in their sequence. So we can duplicate this spacer that goes above the button and use that to find out the correct spacing for our link. And with our link, it's in a similar situation where if we were to toggle on its hover state, we can actually see the dimension of the link as it would affect the layout. So I want to drag the spacer to meet that top edge. And next up, we need to create another layout grid layer on the component to match this top edge of this spacer. So we can go back to our primitive component layer, add another layout grid. This will be a row, a single row with 0 gutter. And I'm going to put in a guess here. I think it's probably somewhere around, I don't know, 76 pixels or so. Let's up the opacity to 50%. Looks like we came in a little bit shy of where we need to be. So we can manually adjust this. It looks like it comes in at 89 high, just because the text height is a little bit off of our even scale here, but that's fine. We can drag this down to come below some of the other layout grid layers. And you can see at this stage, it would be really handy to be able to name these layers since we're starting to account for variations in addition to all the layout rules for our default card. But for now, we just have to kind of manually track things. So with that variation in place, we can turn off this layout grid as well as get this spacer positioned correctly. And we'll disable that temporarily. We can restore other spacers that we used for the button and image combination and bring those back for now. So we'll turn off our link and get everything restored back to its default. All right, so with that in place, I think we'll account for 2 other variations. Again, more simplified use cases for these cards. So next up, I want to picture what it would look like to have basically just a title instead of this paragraph text. So let's duplicate this layer and call it card title. And we'll delete this paragraph text entirely. Let's make sure we turn off our body layer so we can see what we're doing on this new layer that we have. And I'm going to drag out a ruler to match the bottom edge of this line height exactly. And that way we can get our text box sized as needed. And so with this title variation, I don't think we need to do anything else because the spacing between the title and the button will remain the same. So all we would need to do is modify the height of this component when it comes time to take care of that variation. So we can turn off the card title. And the next use case for this card would be an instance where the entire card is basically functioning as a link. So we'll still have the card image. Let's turn on our card title temporarily here, but we'll want to bring in that chevron icon that we saw at the beginning, and that'll indicate that the whole card is a clickable target. So in this use case, we wouldn't have a button turned on at all, but let's go to our components tab, go to our icons, drag in this chevron icon and get it roughly aligned here. Let's also be sure to change the fill of the actual icon path to be birch so we can see it easier here. And using the whole frame of the icon, let's get things aligned with our title. So we'll want to select both and vertically align them to be centered with each other. And let's be sure to duplicate this title because we'll want to modify its width a little bit for this variation. So here we can rename the icon layer, be card link icon. And here let's rename this title layer to be title narrow, maybe as a variation. One thing that I would like to do is bring in a spacer, again, that 32 pixels of spacing, and have that as an actual gap between the icon and the width of the title. So that way we know if text needs to wrap, how much visual space to leave between these elements. So I actually want to turn on our spacing layer temporarily here and drag it below our top margin that we see here. So with that in place, let's make sure everything's positioned as needed. It looks like it matches that left edge of the icon. So now let's select our narrow title, and we'll actually want to bring the width in to hit that left edge. Right, so in this use case, again, all we'd want is 32 pixels on the bottom with this layout grid that we see here. So we would just be able to adjust the height as needed. So we can turn off that temporary spacer and restore things back to normal. So that way we can take a look at our default use case. And one thing I'm seeing is we want to group these 2 layers. So let's rename that group and call it the title link, the card title link. Looking good. We can turn that off by default. Let's restore that kind of normal use case with all of the combinations that we initially established here. All right, so I know that's a little confusing, but basically we established all the variations that we'll need inside of our primitive component. And now you'll see that we can drag out different instances, toggle between those layers, and then componentize variations as needed. So the first thing we should do is actually componentize this particular color theme with this combination of elements. So right now, this is just our master component, but we probably shouldn't use this in our designs directly. And you can see that when I create master components, usually I keep them desaturated so that's clear that these are not for use in the final designs. But just to help make that clear here, we're actually going to want to duplicate this component, drag it out so it has consistent spacing in our file here. And we'll want to componentize this instance directly. Looks like we have an extra duplicate, so we can just delete that for now. But this first duplicate we can componentize immediately. So again, Control or Command plus Alt or Option and K. And let's rename this to be card. It's the charcoal theme that we're building here for this dark UI variation. And to make it clear what components each variation has, let's call this image plus title plus body plus button. So it lists off all the subcomponents. Next up, let's go back to our card primitive, drag out another instance. And this one will represent the use case where it has all these elements, but the button extends the full width. So let's drag this down in our layers. Let's turn off the button, turn on the button block layer, componentize it, and rename it accordingly. So this will be image, title, body, and button block. Looking good. Let's move on to some of the more distinct variations here. So this latest instance, let's make this the one that only has text instead of an image. So we'll want to disable that image. In terms of spacing, we no longer need this large spacer here, nor do we need this top spacer probably, so we can turn that off as well. And we'll want to turn off our default body and instead turn on this body standalone layer. Looks like in our primitive, we should probably rearrange these layers just a little bit. So let me move that down just so it makes more sense in the other instances of that component. That's looking good. I think all we need to adjust in this use case is the height from here. So let's get that dialed in. And it's kind of hard to spot where the bottom of that text frame actually is. So here's a quick trick for that. So we can select our text frame. Let's hit R and drag out a rectangle that matches those dimensions exactly. And if we're unsure, we can double check with that layer selected to make sure it hits on it as needed. So that looks correct there. And we're just using this as a visual guide for now to dial in the height that we're looking for. So we can get the height adjusted as needed. That's looking correct at 484 tall. We can delete this temporary rectangle for now, and our layout should work as expected. So with that, let's componentize this variation. This is charcoal, and it has the title, the body, and the button. And actually, one thing I forgot to do with this variation is we want our text link. So let's turn off the button, bring in our text link. We're also going to want to modify our layout grid a little bit here. So we can turn off this bottommost one and engage our text link spacing. And lastly, in our spacing layers, again, this is completely optional, just how much you want to document the layout of the component. We want to turn off this particular spacer and bring in the one above our text link just to help out visually. And I think we'll need to bring that rectangle back in just for now to help get things aligned. So it looks like that's the bottom of the text layer. Let's adjust the height once more. One thing I'm noticing is we have to bring this rectangle out so it doesn't scale with the component. So now we should be able to dial in the height without that changing. Okay, that's looking good. Get rid of our temporary layout rectangle there. Now we have a solid variation of this where we can turn off the spacing by default. Let's go through and do that for each of our variations that we created, just so they look a little bit nicer by default. We're starting to see all of our variations come into life. Next up, let's address the two more simplified instances of this card. We'll drag out a new instance below. And this one is going to have just the title and the button. So already our layers look correct here. We want the height to be set up as needed. And again, we might have to bring in that rectangle trick just to know where the bottom of the text layer ends up. So we can dial in the height of our component. Zoom in, it's looking good. get rid of this rectangle, and now we're ready to componentize this variation. So let's turn off our spacing by default and rename this to be card. This is still the charcoal theme. It has the image, title, and button. All right, one last one for the charcoal theme. And for this variation, we want to basically have the whole card act as that tap target. So we're not going to have any button. Instead, we'll have that title link layer, turn off our body, and still keep the image up top. But we know we don't need some of these layout grid layers. So let's disable the one that's for that button. While we're at it, we'll go through our spacers and turn off this spacer that's specific to the button as well. Looks like we have 2 instances of that one that got duplicated by accident. So in our primitive, we can actually go into the spacing layer, figure out which one that would be. And we can delete one of those as needed. That way there's only one in all of the subcomponents. So now if we go back into this layer, we just have that turned off in terms of its visibility, which is great. One last time, let's drag out a rectangle to get the text sizing that we need and adjust the height accordingly. All right, that's looking good. So this would be card, charcoal, and this will have image. And let's say this is the title link variation. And one last thing, let's turn off our spacing layer for now. And that's looking good. So this demonstrates how you can componentize tons of variations with a card with only having one master component. And even though there's a lot of complexity, and I know a lot of the work to get here was a little bit tedious, now what we have is the ability to drag in any one of these instances and quickly swap between the different variations as needed. And to help illustrate the power of this further, what we'll do is create an initial card in a light UI theme variation. So that way, not only would you have different layout combinations with different subcomponents, but you could also swap out color theming as needed to facilitate a whole wide array of design use cases. So let's drag out another instance of our card primitive here. And with this one, we'll basically just want to make some color theming changes as needed. So the first thing is let's get the card plate instead of charcoal. Let's switch it over to be birch. I think our drop shadow is probably a little too aggressive. So let's change the blur to be a little bit less here. Looks like something around 12 looks pretty good. Still want a little bit of spread though. So let's keep that maybe around 16. And I think our opacity needs to go down definitely by a good bit. I think I like it around 20 or 30. I'm going to leave it at 20% opacity. Yep, that should be distinct enough to give it some elevation that we're seeing. Next up with a card button, we want to swap this out. If we go into our buttons, drop down here, instead of birch, this will actually be a default charcoal instance. And let's edit this text to be learn more. That's looking good. Let's quickly turn on our button block variation. We'll do the same with instance swapping here. This will be the default charcoal yet again. Learn more is our CTA. Looks like we need to rename these layers as they come in, which is fine. Let's handle our text link here. Go to instances. This will be our charcoal link and just the default desktop variation. Again, learn more as the call to action. I think the width works already. Yep, so that should be set in place. Next up, our card body needs to be charcoal 14. Same with our standalone and the title. So we get those in place and then we can check those one by one. Those are looking good. Our title link, we want to show this. The actual title again will be charcoal 14. And the icon, we want that path to also be that dark charcoal color. So now if we engage those, everything has good contrast, which is great. And our card image can stay the same. So basically this represents that default instance for the birch theme. We actually need to componentize this, and similar to above where we had a primitive instance for charcoal variation, I think I want to make an instance that is specific to birch. And what we'll do as a start is just drag out this maximum use case, quickly componentize this, and rename it to follow our naming convention above. So card birch, and this will be the image, title, body, and the button. So with that in place, what I'm going to do is quickly go through the remaining variations of layouts and subcomponents we see above, but establish those for this light UI theme, and then we'll check back in and demonstrate the power of instance swapping with these complex components to address any combination of layout and color theming as needed in our designs. Alright, so with those variations established in this secondary light UI theme, what we can do now is basically show how these would be used in a really robust design. So what we can do is go into our cards section of our components tab, and let's just say we want a charcoal instance of this simple text-heavy card implementation, but later down the line we realize, hey, actually we want to bring an image and a button instead to give a little more affordance to this. And maybe as part of the design iteration, we actually need to change its color theme to be light UI themed. So with that, we can go into our instance menu here, go into cards, we want the birch theme, and then we can switch this to be this kind of default use case. Similarly, if we wanted to go and simplify a card instance, we could go to a different theme if we wanted to, or at least kind of reduce the complexity of this down to be more text-based, or perhaps just be a title link where the whole card is a tap target. You can see the power of quickly swapping things out. And because we have actual layout grid rules inside of here, as well as layout constraints, we can actually edit this text to be any length that we need, adjust the height accordingly, or even make a narrower variation for mobile pretty simply by swapping out some text styles for mobile, as well as changing the width, and everything else should adapt accordingly. So I think that does it for this how-to. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this process for creating complex components in Figma is useful for you in your work. As I mentioned earlier, these techniques with layout grids and having a master instance that contains different variations of subcomponents can all be applied to create even more complicated layouts and designs that still have a ton of adaptability. So be sure to check out the Figma design files for this project, which are linked in the description. And feel free to leave a comment if there are any other how-to videos that you'd like to see about Figma or the UX development process in general. Thanks again for watching, and be sure to keep a lookout for more how-to videos, as well as more Build UX UI series videos that'll come out soon.